Hi, it's Miss Vitale. This is the second podcast in the evolution series, and it is on the history of evolution. Over 2,000 years ago, Aristotle came up with a concept that he called scala naturae. That means the scale of nature. What he basically said was that every type of organism occupies a rung on a ladder, and every rung is taken. The species there are permanent, perfect, and they don't evolve. This view of life was believed for over 2,000 years. Natural theology is the Christian belief in the Old Testament where Genesis says that species were individually designed and created by a higher power. It's really what we consider creation. Carolus Linnaeus was a Swedish physician and botanist. He specialized in taxonomy, which was naming and classifying organisms. He developed binomial nomenclature, which is the two-name system that he gave organisms. He grouped organisms together, but didn't really imply any evolutionary relationships. Fossils were some of the first evidence of evolution. Fossils are relics or impressions in rock of organisms from the past. Because fossils form in sedimentary rock, the layers there, called the strata, represent the history of life on Earth. It really is basically a timeline. The deeper layers usually have fossils of older organisms. Georges Cuvier was a French anatomist who developed the study of fossils called paleontology. He realized that the history of life is recorded in the fossil layers, as I said, called strata. However, he believed in catastrophism, which basically said that each layer of strata was formed by a catastrophe which wiped out all of life and then it restarted again. James Hutton was a Scottish geologist. He developed the theory of gradualism. This is a view of Earth's history that attributes profound changes to the cumulative product of slow but continuous processes. Charles Lyell was a Scottish geologist who developed the theory of uniformitarianism. That states that geologic processes have not changed throughout Earth's history, and the forces that changed Earth are the same today as they were in the past. By Hutton and Lyell. He thought that if Earth changed slowly, it must be old, and slow changes over a long time can add up to big changes. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was a French biologist. He came from a poor family, and he was a tutor to Count George, the son of Louis Leclerc Buffon. Buffon was a French biologist. Buffon had earlier discovered evolution, but was afraid to admit it. He told church elders the earth must be more than 6,000 years old, and they threatened him with excommunication, so he quickly recanted. In later years, in 1753, he wrote, "But if we once admit that there are families of plants and animals, so that the ass may be of the family of the horse, and that the one may only differ from the other through degeneration from a common ancestor, we might be driven to admit that the ape is of the family of man." And as if that wasn't bad enough, he added, "Then there is no future limit to be set to the power of nature, and we should not be wrong in supposing that with sufficient time she could have evolved all other organized forms from one primordial type." Lamarck studied medicine and botany. He said plants and animals are related and coined the word biology. He named hundreds of species and wrote over a dozen books on fossils. He also coined the term invertebrate. While studying living and fossil organisms, he recognized the clear line of descent from older fossils to more recent fossils to modern organisms. Lamarck published his theory of evolution in 1809, which was the same year that Darwin was born. Lamarck's hypothesis began with use and disuse. This states that features that are used become larger and stronger, and those not used will deteriorate. The second part of his theory was inheritance of acquired characteristics. This states that modifications developed during the life of an organism are passed on to the offspring. Charles Darwin was born in Shrewsbury, England in 1809. As a boy, he loved nature and hunting. When he was 16 years old, he went to the University of Edinburgh. His dad really forced him to go, and he was to study medicine. But he didn't like surgeries without anesthesia, and one particular one that he witnessed on a child made him quit medical school. He went home, and then his father sent him to study theology at Cambridge University. Darwin met Reverend John Henslow there, who was a professor of botany. Henslow became his mentor. When Darwin graduated at age 21, Henslow recommended him for a position as the ship's naturalist on the HMS Beagle. It was a 5-year voyage to map South America and the Pacific Ocean. Darwin collected thousands of specimens of organisms and fossils. He filled volumes with his observations. For example, rheas are birds in South America, and when he observed them, they changed as he moved south through the continent. But he found the best examples on the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands lie on the equator west of the northern part of South America. He looked at 14 species of finches that were slightly different from each other. Their beaks were adapted for different food. The Galapagos also has species found nowhere else in the world. Those types of organisms are called endemic, but they also resembled some of the South American species. It took Darwin 20 years to publish his findings and his theory, partially because he feared the outcome. In 1858, 1 year before The Origin of the Species was published, he befriended Lyell, and he was at that point a respected naturalist. Another naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace, had written to Darwin for a few years about selective breeding and evolution. Wallace soon devised an evolution hypothesis based on natural selection, and he told Darwin. Darwin was about to give credit to Wallace, but his family got scarlet fever and his 19-month-old son died. So Darwin turned all of his affairs over to Lyell, who presented Wallace's paper and an extract from Darwin's unpublished work to the scientific community. A year later, Origin was published. When it appeared in 1859, all 1,250 copies of the first printing sold out in one day. It is probably the single most influential scientific book ever written. Darwin wrote of descent with modification, which is what we now call evolution. He looked at Linnaeus's classification system, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, and as a reflection of a branching family tree and evolutionary relationships. His principles of natural selection included basic facts and inferences. The first fact is overproduction. Species produce more offspring than will survive. Not all of the offspring reproduce because they die early. The inference of overproduction is competition. Competition is the struggle for existence, and therefore only some will survive to reproduce. Another fact was variations. They exist among individuals in a species. Many variations are heritable. The inference of variations is that those variations give the individual an advantage in their environment. That will be passed on to the offspring. A second inference of variations is that those desirable traits will accumulate in the population. Some of the evidences of evolution include homologous structures. The study of homologous structures is called homology. Homologous structures arise from the same structures in a common ancestor. It's a type of comparative anatomy. Vestigial structures are parts of an organism with little or no function, but which had a function in an ancestral species. Another type of comparative anatomy are embryos. Embryos' similarities indicate common ancestry. For example, on this picture, fish, salamander, tortoise, chicks, pigs, calves, rabbits, and humans are all vertebrates. They all begin with tails and gill slits and look very similar in their early embryonic stages. DNA and proteins is a more recent type of evidence supporting evolution. It's a type of molecular biology, as you know, and basically more closely related species have more DNA and more proteins in common. And again, the fossil record. The order that fossils appear in the layers or strata of sedimentary rock is found in the fossil record. It shows that organisms have evolved. The oldest fossils are prokaryotes, which are considered to be the ancestor of all life, and those fossils are considered to be 3.5 billion years old. Paleontologists study fossils.